All right. So now let's use something that psychologists have been interested in for a long time, but have only really been thoroughly studying since probably about 1960. Love, the concept of love. Prior to 1960, part of the reason why love was not studied very often scientifically is that it was hard to figure out observations that we could make that we could call evidence of love. So people started getting creative, came up with ways to measure things that might be indicative of love. Nobody's really been able to come up with a generalized definition of the concept of love. When you were younger, you probably asked older people, how will I know when I'm in love? And they told you things like, oh, you'll know it when you're in it. You're like, that's helpful. Could you be a little bit more specific? Could you give me an actual definition? All of us have difficulty defining love. So what scientists have done who want to study love is they've tried to break down component parts of love into things that are directly observable and measurable, and have been pursuing it from that angle. Okay, so the first example that I have is a video on distractibility. If you watch the video, please be aware that the guy has a pretty good accent. I can't remember. It's either Irish or Scottish. I'm not exactly sure. And he's describing the research that he did, and so and he kind of mutters. So you might want to turn up your volume, listen to what he's saying. When you come back, I'll talk a little bit about it. So go ahead and watch that video. It's in the PowerPoints. Okay, so presuming you either went to see it or you're planning on watching it later. The idea in his research is that if you're in love, you will be distracted by your love object. Now, of course, he's got a really, really broad definition of love. He's really talking about like attraction, right? And you don't even have to know the person who has the characteristics that you find attractive for that to distract you, to pull your attention away from what you were supposed to be doing and onto them. So that was the idea with his research. He's like, if you're attracted, you will be more distractible than if you're not attracted. Okay, so love, we're going to operationally define it as attraction as measured by distractibility. Okay, now is that a wholesale definition of love? Absolutely not. You would be thinking to yourself, I don't know if that's a satisfying definition of love or not. That's fine. Each researcher has the option to define the concept however they want and in whatever way they can measure it. So for example, some researchers have defined love as being in a state of arousal. Some of you may have crossed this bridge that's in the picture. It's the Capilani Bridge up in British Columbia. I can confidently say I have not crossed it because rickety bridges are not my favorite thing, that's for sure. But in this study, half of the men crossed this rickety bridge and then were met by a female research assistant. The other half of the men crossed just the regular bridge that the cars drove across and were greeted by that same female research assistant. I should mention that all the men in the study were heterosexual, and when they were greeted by the female research assistant, she was pretending to be like a poll taker. You know, did you enjoy the bridge? Why are you here? Yada yada. If you have any questions about the research, here's my card and you can feel free to call me later. So they all were given the same card with her phone number on it and the same exact set of questions. The only difference was, did I walk across a rickety bridge that might have gotten my heart rate up? Or did I walk across a regular bridge that presumably did not get my heart rate up? What they found is that the men whose heart rates were raised by going over the scarier bridge were much more likely to call the female research assistant later than the ones who had walked across the regular bridge. This was one of those attempts to define love as arousal. If you're aroused, will you then feel love, or let's be honest, attraction? Again, another one of these sort of, it's not a good, it's not a perfect definition, but it's observable, it's verifiable, so it allows us to at least take a step forward in the research. Here's another one that was really fun. This isn't the actual study, I just found a picture from the internet of two people gazing into each other's eyes to illustrate what's going on. In the actual study, The researchers theorized that people who are in love will gaze into each other's eyes more often than people who are not in love. And if that's true, then the flip would be true. If you gaze into someone's eyes for a long time, it will make you feel more attracted to them. So they got female participants and male participants. All of them were heterosexual. They were put into male-female dyads, little pairs, and they were told that the study was about ESP, extrasensory perception. And to get each other in tune so that they could send messages to each other telepathically, they were supposed to, in half the cases, stare into each other's eyes for a protracted period of time, or in the other half of the cases, they were to stare at each other's hands for that same protracted amount of time. After it was all over, of course, there was no test of their extrasensory perception, but they were each taken into a separate room to complete some paperwork. And in the paperwork was questions about how attractive they found their partner to be. And the ones who stared into each other's eyes found their partners much more attractive than the ones who stared at each other's hands. So that confirmed the hypothesis that eye gazing can lead to attraction, and that just as much as being attracted can lead you to eye gaze. Okay. If you're going to make friends, Larry, you must learn that there's a fine line between eye contact and the piercing stare of a psychopath. Because there was this protracted eye gazing period of time that was kind of creepy. But it's one of these, I'd like to call it elegant methods of measuring love where, I've just taken this little tiny bit of it and I've operationally defined love as this little tiny bit of it just for the purpose of my study. Other people could measure it the same way and verify my claims. Another technique that people have used for measuring love is commitment. If a pair makes a commitment to each other, they're perceived to be more in love than people who haven't made a commitment. Or those who maintain their commitment longer are viewed as more in love. Now, I picked this picture on purpose. It's Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston getting married because, of course, just like everything else I've talked about, there's some, problems with this particular definition, right? Commitments are not really permanent, and people who stay married aren't always still in love the entire time. So it's a shaky measurement, but again, it gets at something that is measurable, is independently verifiable by other people. So it gets at a part of what we mean by love. So yeah, none of these definitions is fully satisfying, but it allows us to at least study the concept and move forward. Taken across all these different studies, we start to get a pattern of behavior that really, if you're studying eye gazing and I'm studying distractibility and someone else is studying arousal, we start putting all this stuff together and it starts to make a pattern, right? So each individual study is going to contribute to the overall knowledge. All right, so what operationism tells us is that we need to construct operational definitions for our research. What that means is we're going to define these concepts by how they're going to be measured. So the concept of love is going to be defined as the measurement that we're going to use for measuring love. Now, I gave you behavioral examples on my previous slide. There are also love scales that you can take that would measure, your feelings of love, other things. But so we've got things like, I'm going to operationally define love as distractibility and whether you shift your eyes from what you're supposed to be doing onto the attractive thing. I'm going to define it as arousal. If your heart rate goes up, then you're going to be feeling attraction. If you do eye gazing, if you're doing a lot of staring, if you get married, these are all examples of operational definitions of a pretty complex concept, but it allows us to study the concept concretely. So it may not be a full definition, but it does allow other researchers to know how the concept is being defined in the current study, so that then they can use the same technique when they conduct their own study. All right, so like I said, operationism is a philosophical endeavor also, but it tells us that we have to do these things, define our concepts by how they'll be measured, and make sure that those measurements are directly observable by other people, verifiable by other people, in order for science to move forward in the absence of these, essential definitions. Okay, let's go ahead and take another little break, and when we come back, we'll talk about faith versus science. And please remember, I'm not going to be talking about religion when I say faith. Okay, see you in the next segment.